If a soldier can't face death, he can't run for his life. When we hear this word for the first time, it sounds quite ambitious. And given the danger, the number of people who can escape remains limited. However, extraordinary situations such as war make people more fearless about dangers. In the war on the lands of Eastern Europe, we have repeatedly witnessed revolts and desertions. The last example of this situation occurred yesterday. During the two-week counteroffensive, Ukraine made modest but steady progress in 3 areas of attack along the 1,000-kilometer front line. This advance of Kiev put seeds of fear in the hearts of the Russian soldiers as counterattack operations gain momentum. Sensational news continues to come from the front lines. Undoubtedly, the most striking of these news was the Russian soldiers fleeing from the front. According to the Ukrainian military, Russian fighters are fleeing the front line in eastern Ukraine as Kiev's counterattack gains momentum. Moscow forces battling the ongoing counteroffensive from Kiev are suffering the highest casualties since the peak of the fight for the destroyed Ukrainian city of Bakhmut earlier this year. According to a British intelligence assessment, Russian forces have lost about 9,000 soldiers since the Ukrainian army launched its counterattack, while there were 9,000 casualties in the Russian army. Escapes were at least 3 times as intense since the beginning of the summer offensive. The Ukrainian army has been capturing several dozen Russian service personnel a day in the Donbass and Zaporizhia regions. The fact that a total of 500 or more Russian posts were rounded up in a single 15-day period matches the capture rate set in the early days of the war when signs of weakening Russian army morale were significant. A reserve soldier serving in the normal 218th Regiment of Russia made striking statements after he was caught. The soldier claimed that Russian artillery and tanks did not support his unit during the war. Another POW stated that his defensive position had 3 tanks supporting him, but only 2 of the vehicles were crewed. Daniel Baranov, a Novosibirsk resident and a member of a special operations unit, said his unit's position was under continuous, accurate Ukrainian artillery fire for 10 days and then surrounded the position of the infantry of the Ukrainian armed forces. Baranov stated that when the Russians ran out of ammunition, they had no choice but to surrender. The fact that more than 27,000 Russian soldiers escaped from the front and more than 500 were captured by Ukrainian forces in just 2 weeks shows that the counterattack achieved its main purpose. So, in which regions are the Russian soldiers mostly deserting? We are a team that strives for real justice and freedom for Ukraine. If you are against the invasion of Ukraine and want to support the work of our team, you can like our video, comment, and hit the super thanks button below. Earlier this month, footage circulating in Ukrainian media showed Moscow troops firing at their retreating soldiers. These images offered the opportunity to make a very clear inference about the course of the war. Russian soldiers had lost faith and hope in the war that their leader had started. Also, the escape and surrender of the Russians had been repeated for a very long time. In the last days of May, several dozen armed convicts fleeing the Luhansk region caused turmoil in Rostov. 39 armed soldiers from the Storm Detachment fled. Lysychansk, Ukraine's occupied Luhansk region. The deserted soldiers were all ex-convicts who went to fight under contract. During the escape, a soldier from the self-proclaimed LPR Ministry of State Security was killed while trying to stop the deserters. Previously, Russia had created military prisons to hold mobilized soldiers who were detained and arrested. Such a step was taken to reduce the number of cases of desertion and voluntary desertion of troops, which have recently become more frequent in the army of the Russian Federation. In addition, the situation was quite dire for the soldiers who could not escape from the front lines. The operational update of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that Moscow troops moved away from the front lines in the disputed eastern Luhansk region. The Ukrainian General Staff said that a group of Russian soldiers fleeing their positions defined as mobilized forces were found in the Ukrainian village of Novorossish. It was stated that the search operations for the fleeing soldiers were also carried out by the Russian National Guard. Desertion has become a documented problem for Russian forces in Ukraine. In November 2022, the UK Ministry of Defense stated that Kremlin generals may have authorized the use of weapons against deserters, including allowing fire to cover such floors after a warning has been issued. In fact, the tactic of shooting deserters attests to the low quality, low morale, and indiscipline of the Russian forces during the 2-week counterattack. Ukraine attacked from 4 directions on the entire front line. The Ukrainian offensive made modest but steady progress. Most of the Ukrainian forces are held in reserve as the troops launch probing attacks. Ukrainian troops are waiting for a sufficiently large opening in the Russian defense to launch a main offensive and try to retake territory in the south of the country. Ukrainian troops are attacking at 3 points. They advanced north and south of the firmly Russian-controlled city of Bakhmut, south of Zaporizhia, and in southern Donetsk, where several villages were recaptured. The Kiev forces are advancing decisively in these directions, liberating the Russian-occupied areas and flying their national flags there. On the other hand, it was not only the Ukrainian armed forces that captured Russian soldiers. Anti-Kremlin rebels claimed to have captured large numbers of Russian soldiers in the city of Belgorod near the Ukrainian border. Paramilitary forces opposing Vladimir Putin's regime had invited the city's governor to meet with them in order to deliver the detainees and hold talks. However, the Russian Volunteer Corps and Russia's Freedom Legion jointly announced that Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov could not find the courage to meet with them, and they would hand over their captives to Ukraine. Gladkov stated on Telegram that he accepted the talks if the soldiers were shown to be alive, but he thought that they were probably killed. They later released another video that appears to show even more prisoners. It said that neither the army nor the civilian leadership was interested in the fate of the captured men. The Legion branded the Russian authorities as rotten and cowardly. Russian casualties are also peaking amid allegations, desertions, and fierce battles on the lines. As it's known, the heart of the war continues to beat in the east and south axes, especially in the last days. Zaporizhia Oblast was quite active. Ukrainian reconnaissance officers located the Russian military headquarters in the occupied village of Mikhailivka in the Zaporizhia Oblast. The defense forces of Ukraine carried out an attack operation at the designated coordinate. Ukrainian defense forces and Ukrainian artillery units carried out this operation jointly. The attack operation against the headquarters took place at around 2:30 p.m. Successful artillery fire blew up the Russian headquarters. The violence of the explosion was quite appalling as the ammunition in the headquarters exploded after the explosion. A cloud of dust and debris remained from the headquarters. Ammunition powder was very important in counterattack operations, but the supply nodes of Russian troops have been repeatedly targeted by Ukraine. Insufficient ammunition and equipment were another factor that demoralized the Russian soldiers. The Russian soldiers who have been struggling with the same problems since the beginning of the war had no choice but to flee. It seems that the Ukrainian counterattack will continue to advance against the Russian army. Ukrainian forces may have made small gains, but the fear that has been instilled in the hearts of the Russian military has been Ukraine's real gain. The Russian army has shaken all its dominance in the regions it has occupied for almost a year in Ukraine. And now the excuses to prevent the Russian soldiers from escaping from the front are running out. The desertion of Russian soldiers, their capture, the loss of their lives on the front line, including important commanders, once again reveals the meaninglessness of Vladimir Putin's war. As the Ukraine army liberated 8 settlements in total on the critical front line between Zaporizhia and Donetsk, major offensive operations continued after the Zaporizhia-Donetsk front line. The Ukrainians turned especially in the direction of Bakhmut-Severodonetsk. The liberation of Batagayka gave Kiev a chance to advance to Luhansk via Donetsk. The Ukrainian forces also used their luck wisely, launching counterattacks not only on the front lines around Severodonetsk, but also in critical junctions areas such as Kremenostat-Hof. In Stuthof, clashes had already intensified with the destruction of the Russian airbase by the Ukrainian forces. After achieving critical success in this region, the Ukrainian armed forces are now turning their offensive axis mostly into the woodlands of Luhansk. In addition, the Ukrainians managed to reach the Kharkiv border lines and even the surrounding front lines in this region. The Russians also tried to prevent the Ukrainian attacks on all these front lines, and Putin's army again tried to carry out a new counterattack in these regions. But these attempts of the Russians were blocked by the Ukrainian forces. And even the unsuccessful attempts of the Russians to attack prepared the ground for the offensive operations against the Ukrainians. Anna Maliar, Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, shared these critical data. According to Anna Maliar, Ukrainian forces blew through the woods of Luhansk-Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region and the Lyman front line in Donetsk. These data were officially confirmed from Ukrainian military sources. Let's take a look at what has been happening on these hot front lines. The Ukrainian defense forces stopped the advance of the Russian army in Kupiansk and Lyman. Attempts by the Russian army to stretch the Ukrainian forces at the front were unsuccessful. In other words, the Russian attack on Kupiansk and Lyman was blocked. Also, the Russians tried to break through the Ukrainian defense in the Dybrovo-Serebryansky, Forestry, and Grigorievka area. But as we mentioned to you, these offensive operations of the Russians ignited a counterattack action for the Ukrainian forces because the Ukrainian forces took advantage of the unsuccessful Russian attacks and wasted their military resources and made a sudden attack. Geographical images. They managed to destroy the soldiers of the Stormzy detachments of the Ukrainian armed forces, the armored invaders, and the 80th Tank Regiment in the Bryansk Forestry. On the same day, Ukrainian defenders destroyed Anonymity, 80 Tank near Chervona Popovka. After the striking offensive operations, the attempt of the armed forces of Ukraine to advance from Belogorovka towards Shabalovka was reported. On the other hand, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation announced that 5 attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces on the Kuzmino and Bryansk forest area were repelled. Critical statements of the Russian ministry, we think, are one of the attempts of Russian resources to ignore Kiev's major offensive plans because the continuation of the progress of the Ukrainians in the aforementioned areas reveals all the realities. Even now, the RF armed forces have to struggle to hold previously occupied positions and areas. It is known that the main task of the Russian army was to create a buffer zone in the Crimea region to region northern bank of the Seversky Donets River and to capture Belogorovka. But Russian military correspondents admitted that Putin's army had been trying to withdraw from the Belogorovka area for several months, but was unsuccessful. The Russians will be able to put their plan into action only if the landing forces advance from the north and the second group of troops begins to advance from Lysychansk. Russian armed forces had previously failed to cross the Seversky Donets River, north of Belogorovka, in May 2022. And it is unlikely that the Russians will successfully cross the river in the same area during the now ongoing Ukraine counteroffensive gifts. Offensive plans are progressing successfully so far. The Russian army's lack of military resources, collapses in morale, and motivation are allowing the Ukrainians to expand into wider areas, taking advantage of this negative situation of the Russians. The Ukrainian defenders continue their ground attacks on the Kupiansk-Svatov line. According to the press service of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Ukraine defenders achieved serious success in the Belogorovka-Dybrovo region. The Russian positions here were dispersed after long clashes and Putin's troops took a defensive position. Russian sources continue to ignore the success of the Ukrainian forces in Kupiansk. The Russian Defense Minister announced that the Ukrainian armed forces managed to repel 2 counterattacks in the Sinkov and Novosyolovsky district. However, the Ukrainians achieved remarkable success in their attacks in these areas, and they also succeeded in blocking the Russians advancing towards Golubivka. According to military experts, the Russians' plans to withdraw Ukrainian forces from Bakhmut, near Lyman and Kupiansk, which toured the Russian flanks there and gradually put the city in the pincers, were thwarted. So how did the Ukrainians succeed in advancing so successfully in the Luhansk-Kharkiv regions? After Zaporizhzhia Donetsk front line. According to many war experts and military analysts, this is due to the mind-blowing tactics of the legendary Ukrainian commander, Valery Zaluzhny, chosen by the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces. Valery Zaluzhny are clearly very effective in the operational areas. Ukrainian Armed Forces Reserve Colonel and pilot trainer, military expert Roman Svetin shared the important assessments on this issue. Roman Svetin explained that previously Zaluzhny worked in the most difficult areas as well as in troops. Svetin noted that at the moment, Zaluzhny is conducting all the critical phases of Kiev's counterattack. Operation Alsos with unthreaded. Zaluzhny is a completely foreign obscurity for Putin abroad and in Ukraine. Zaluzhny's statistics are generally not predicted by either Russian leader Vladimir Putin or the Supreme Commander of the Russian Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov. Few are aware when the Ukrainian armed forces captured a total of 8 settlements on the Zaporizhzhia Donetsk critical front line. Russian sources first denied this, but when the situation arose, the Russian Ministry of Defense had to admit that it was true. Among the reasons why the Russians initially denied this news was that Putin thought it unlikely that the Ukrainian army would make any progress in Zaporizhzhia Donetsk in such a short time. However, although Putin currently thinks otherwise, or is confident that the Ukrainians will one day stop advancing, the Ukrainian army, led by the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny, is advancing successfully in Luhansk and Kharkiv borders lines and can easily fend off the Russian attacks here. According to Zaluzhny said tactics, the Ukrainian armed forces advance with ground infantry and air missile attacks to destroy Russian troops with the help of artillery on the move. It is not surprising, therefore, that Ukrainian troops liquidated 1,000 Russians in one day. Also, the losses of the Russians after the total attack in Luhansk and Kharkiv Oblast did not come as a surprise. After these stunning Ukrainian attacks, the Russian army lost 23 artillery pieces, 15 armored combat vehicles, 8 tanks, and 52 helicopters in addition to these losses. If the progress of the Ukrainian continues in this way, Luhansk-Kharkiv direction will become a 100% losing direction for the Russians in the north of Donetsk, in Luhansk and Kharkiv. The Ukrainian armed forces are liberating occupied territories, as in the south of Ukraine. Anti-Kremlin rebels claim to have captured large numbers of Russian soldiers in the city of Belgorod, near the Ukrainian border. Rebel forces opposed to Vladimir Putin's regime had invited the city's governor to meet with them in order to deliver the detainees and hold talks. However, the Russian Volunteer Corps and Russia's Freedom Legion said in a joint statement that the governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov, could not find the courage to meet with them, and that they would deliver their captives to Ukraine. Russia blamed Ukraine for recent attacks in border areas. However, Kiev flatly denied any direct involvement in the incident. The Russian military said the other day that its artillery had hit an insurgent group near the village of Novaya Tauls. Hunker and the group dispersed and retreated. UK government officials cited the existence of a video showing the two prisoners, although they reported it was not possible to independently verify their identities. Gladkov said he would agree to talks if the soldiers were shown to be alive, but he thought they were probably killed. Later, Russia's Freedom Legion released another video that appeared to show even more prisoners. It was said that neither the army nor the civilian leadership was interested in the fate of the captured soldiers. The Legion described Russian officials as rotten and cowardly, and reiterated that they would hand over the captives to Ukraine to be exchanged for Ukrainian prisoners of war. So who are these groups? Ukrainian officials say the two rebel groups are made of Russian soldiers and anti-Putin citizens who want to create a safety zone for Ukrainians. Volunteer troops carried out a cross-border raid in Russia's Bryansk region last March, while the Russian Freedom Legion continues to fight alongside Ukrainian troops against Russian forces. In a statement, Gladkov described the fighters as scoundrels, murderers, fascists, but he promised to guarantee security if the talks take place. UK intelligence officials reported that Gladkov has not commented on the events since the shared video, but has released pictures of his meeting with regional and federal officials. Belgorod has seen a number of attacks last month, including a cross-border attack that Moscow claims resulted in the deaths of 70 rebels. The UK Ministry of Defense said in a statement that Russian commanders faced a dilemma as border areas were attacked for the second time in 10 days. The UK MOD's new intelligence report comes after a day it said anti-Vladimir Putin militias had again crossed into Russia's Belgorod region. Exiled Russian politician Ilya Ponomarev, who says he is the political representative of Russia's Freedom Legion, said that the group moved to the border town of Shebekino, together with the Russian volunteer troops, which are also affiliated with the Ukrainian army. However, Russian officials said that the attempted attack along its border was repelled, while Belgorod Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov reported that several areas were bombed. But Gladkov also denied that there were any rebel troops on the territory of the Belgorod region. However, the UK Defense Ministry said the Legion had again attacked Russia's Belgorod region. The UK MOD in a complex battlefield situation, a vehicle that looks like a UAV also hit the city of Belgorod. Russian authorities evacuated civilians from the border town of Shebekino after the Ukrainian bombardment, he said. In the past weeks, Belgorod has been attacked by the Freedom of Russia Legion and Russian volunteer units from Ukraine. However, the Russian army and internal forces probably acted faster than before in containing the new raid, but were unsuccessful. The rebels captured the village of Kosenko and said they had entered the town of Graveron, according to a press release issued by the Russian Ministry of Defense. The Russian military has resorted to deploying heavy military firepower, including attack helicopters and the S-1, a heavy thermobaric rocket launcher in the Belgorod area. But Russian commanders were faced with a serious dilemma as to whether to strengthen Russia's defenses in the border areas or in Ukraine. Although the Kremlin ordered an intervention in the Belgorod area, the Russian commanders apparently did not follow through on this order. The expected counteroffensive of the Ukrainian army began last week, and it seems that Russian commanders want to take more defensive measures against this counterattack. Russian generals care more about the lives of their soldiers than the Kremlin, so they chose to strengthen their defense lines in Ukraine and rebelled against the orders of Russian President Putin. In wars, the competencies and skills of generals are more important than army forces. Even if you have the strongest army in the world, if your generals are bad, the army against you can defeat you with the right strategies. This is exactly what Russia has been experiencing since the beginning of the Ukraine war. The notables of the Russian army acted rather amateurishly and indisciplined throughout the war, so much so that Russian President Vladimir Putin dismissed many such unsuccessful and disobedient generals throughout the war. In recent months, the incompetence and indiscipline of the leadership of the Russian army has increased drastically. It seems that these combatant commanders have taken the initiative in losing the war and doing things that the whole world will condemn. Recently, it was announced that the Russian lieutenant general who ordered the bombing of civilians in the Donetsk region and directed the attack on the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol will be put on trial. The Donetsk District Prosecutor's Office submitted an indictment to the court as part of a special preliminary investigation against the commander of the 8th Guards, United Arms Army of the Southern Military District of the Russian Armed Forces. The Russian lieutenant general is accused of committing deliberate acts that, according to the Criminal Code of Ukraine, violated the order to change the territory of Ukraine or state borders, resulting in the death of people and other serious consequences. The pre-trial investigation revealed that the lieutenant general was responsible for the coordination, management, and military planning of Russian military formations. It was also revealed during this preliminary investigation that he ordered the bombing of civilians in the Donetsk region and the seizure of the territory of the region. The lieutenant general had attended a meeting with the so-called head of the Donetsk Republic and Ramzan Kadyrov. At the meeting, a plan was developed for the complete capture of besieged Mariupol and the raid on the Azovstal iron and steel plant, where the personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine were located. Following the attacks, civilians were harmed and trapped in their bunkers for a long time. The lieutenant general also coordinated the actions of sabotage groups to intensify the attack on the enterprise and kill the leading cadres of the Ukrainian military units. Earlier, the commander of a tank battalion of the Russian armed forces was sentenced to 11 years in prison for shooting at a high-rise apartment in Chernihiv. The names of the generals mentioned have been kept secret, but these two cases are the best examples to show us the point of the war. It seems that these generals deliberately harmed the Ukrainian people throughout the war and indirectly involved the innocent Russian people. The Ukrainian army turned into one of the most elite armies in the world after it was equipped with Western weapons and received training from Western countries. However, it cannot be accepted as a normal situation for the Russian army to act like the armies of underdeveloped states against the Ukrainian army. It seems that Russian President Vladimir Putin's decisions regarding the army will continue to cause the death of his soldiers in Ukraine, especially with the successful advance of the Ukrainian army. It's very difficult to predict the future situation of the Russian army. Thanks you for watching us.